You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Homefield Apparel.
Welcome back to Crimson Cast. Galen Clavio, Scott Caulfield joining you. It's Sunday, March 30th. March almost over, Scott. Hard to believe. We were so much anticipating March getting here for the tournament, and then it just goes away. It's like it goes very quickly.
It does. I mean, we always talk about this being like the golden age of sports every year, and it now's the part where it gets a little bit sad because now we're into the lead up of the Masters, and then it'll be 8,500, and then it'll be over. But no, we're here. We still got 2 more days left until my pick for the day Indiana hires their coach. There's still a chance.
There's still a chance they can change their mind.
Breeze takes a different job, and we hire somebody else. Like we could go to more coaching candidates. No, I think I lost that bet.
It's okay. You know what? I also thought it would be longer, and
I'm happy it wasn't.
Yeah, me too.
It's like, wow, let's be done with this.
For a whole variety of reasons, I'm glad it didn't actually take that amount of time. And it is interesting, Scott, watching other programs like still waiting for coaches.
Yeah.
I'm trying to anticipate, like, what would we have talked about in this time period? We had pretty much run out of things.
Well, there also could have been like, just is Richard Pitino going to be the candidate for every job? Like, it's just like, is he going to be coaching 12 teams next year? I guess we could have done a pod on that.
Yeah, he became the Ur candidate for a lot of different openings. I kind of understand why. I'm still a little skeptical about Richard Pitino, and we'll talk about that as we get in because it actually ties in with some of the things we're going to talk about today. But yeah, then news breaks last night / early this morning. The worst kept secret in college basketball that Kevin Willard may be going to Villanova, which now means the Maryland job is open. And well, this is the downside to having a coach like fired or leave this late is like now, like if you weren't already looking for options, or even if you were, you got a mountain to climb because as hard as it was for Indiana to dislodge an already successful coach at a comparative level, I mean, it becomes almost impossible this late in the game. Like people are already set. They're doing what they're going to do for the near future. And we'll talk about all of that a little bit later because I want to talk about like the relative merits of the two jobs and things like that. But yeah, just it's a fascinating environment, and it's just one that's kind of completely unhinged from the college atmosphere that or the amateur atmosphere that they've been trying to shove down our throats for not 1,000 years, but 100 years.
Well, and on this point, because this is very much attuned to the way that you talk about these things, and you hit on the hypocrisy of all of this, but it was out there that Willard was leaving Maryland for Villanova before they played one of their tournament games. It was out there. And what I thought was funny is, there's been the stories, oh my God, 700 players in the portal, players who are on teams that's still in the tournament in the portal. And we got to have a 20-minute discussion on that. And, just completely slamming the players for thinking about leaving, going into a portal while the team's still playing. Not a lot to talk about Willard, the coach.
Well,
basically taking another job, like maybe a little bit, but it's just like, oh, that's what coaches do. It's the hypocrisy of it that, this is a system. It's a bad system, and there's nobody in charge. But the idea that players get in trouble for going into the portal, but a coach can do it before a game, and it's like, oh, that's okay, that's fine.
And it is hypocritical, but then to a lot of people's mind, it is not hypocritical because the coaches, well, of course, they're employees. They can go wherever they want, but the players are not. This is the mindset a lot of people have, which a lot of us who have been kind of banging the drum on that historically are like, that's not really the way to look at it. Like, how do you classify?
The players would be doing it for the love of the school, whereas the coaches do it for money. And it's like, no, we're all doing it for money.
Yeah. Anyways, we'll talk about some of that stuff. We're going to talk about Indiana's roster situation and a lot more throughout the course of the show today. But first of all, just a reminder that we are brought to you by Homefield Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs. Scott, I have a really large head, which makes it very hard for me, like physically. I mean, maybe, I'm sure people would argue metaphorically, but no, just it's a very big head. And it means I am very limited in my hat selection.
I know this.
I can't wear a lot.
We were at Indy 500 trials, and we were like, let's go look at some hats. She was like, no, like they're not going to work. You're very angry toward the hats already.
Yeah, I can do the foam trucker hat, and that's about it. Like everything else is just it just looks bad because of the size of my head. But for those of you with regular sized heads, Home Field has brought back corduroy hats. They're back in stock. You can go to their website, or if you're like me and you're on their email list, you got an email a couple days ago, and the corduroy hats do look really cool. A lot of great options, a lot of teams across the country, and a unique way of showing off your support for your favorite squad. Go over to homefieldapparel.com. Check those out. Use the code HOME23. Get 15% off your first order. That also lets them know that we sent them too. You can maybe leave a note down there as well. Just say, hey, Galen and Scott said we should stop by here at homefieldapparel.com, or follow along on the socials, or do both, actually, would be the best way to go about it. But again, homefieldapparel.com, and we appreciate their sponsorship as always. A reminder, folks, we are on Substack, crimsoncast.substack.com. It's free to sign up, get emails with the podcast delivered right to your inbox, sometimes get some VIP videos, had a couple of those over the course of the last couple of weeks, just a little extra something for the paying subscribers. And you don't have to pay, but if you'd like to help financially support the podcast, it's $5 a month, $50 a year. We certainly appreciate it.
I will note, I mean, it's a correlation of one, but I released a VIP video giving my thoughts on the coaching search, and like 10 minutes later, they announced, like I posted it, and like an hour later, they announced the new coach. So,
see,
I will be doing a post later today about how we're not signing any 5-star transfers, and it'll happen. So I'll start doing things that people want. Like, I take requests.
I appreciate Scott's dedication to letting you all know 10 minutes ahead of time what's going on with things. Like that's really important for him to do that. But yes, it's there's a lot of good options out there in terms of podcasts. We always appreciate you folks choosing us as one of your many places to listen or watch. If you'd like to watch, I mean, obviously we're on Spotify. You get that through your email, but we're also on YouTube, and so are the rest of the Back Home Network shows. So go to Back Home Network, search Back Home Network on YouTube. We are at 7,500 subscribers on YouTube as of yesterday,
which is
it's really exciting. It's a great place to go be part of the community and interact with your fellow listeners or viewers. So again, get over there and hit the subscribe button. Again, free, and it's a good way to get what we are consistently doing here on the podcast network. Scott, let's go ahead and dive into things as we are almost into April. We're almost to the Final Four. We've got 2 games coming up later today. And, I want to start by talking, obviously, about Indiana basketball situation. The Hoosiers with, I think, nobody officially on the roster at this point, and that has caused some freakouts, some consternation in certain circles. But then you've got other folks who are rightly saying, look, pump the brakes. This isn't that big of a deal because of the nature of things. But it is jarring, I will admit, if you're not familiar with how the process works, to see the IU roster and realize, hey, there ain't nobody there. I mean, it is wild thinking about how much this has changed from just a couple of years ago when you knew you were going to have some consistency. But I think it's important for people to realize in this era, especially with coach movement, but also with player movement, this is how it has to be, and it's not just IU that's experiencing this.
I normally am pretty good at crafting these things, but there's a joke in there somewhere. Like, are we going to have enough time for Tucker DeVries on the roster? Like, that's always my joke, is that this time of year we're looking at the roster. It's like, how are we going to get enough minutes for these guys? And then we never do. This is the first time it's like, I think Tucker's gonna be able to play. We got a roster of 1. Like, I think, we're not doing starting lineup. No, it also is, and it's no knock on the players who were here, but the last 2 years were disappointing. We didn't make the tournament 2 years in a row. So it's also, I've always found a funny cognitive dissonance. Everybody's like, oh my God, we lost all of our players, like, on the team that wasn't good.
Right.
like, do we want to bring everybody back and just run it back again? And I know it's a new coach, would make some difference there, but that is what happens. I'm very much in the pump the brakes. Like, just honestly, listen to us, subscribe to podcasts, but chill out and just come back in, check back in the hardcore in like June. Because then we'll have a team then you can look at. Like, the dust it's going to be a weird process to get there. But the other thing too is I feel a little less comfortable if we had a coach who was just in his third year and this was happening. We have a coach who just did this last year. Like literally took a team and everybody left West Virginia. He brought all new players in. And by the way, had the exact same, basically the same season that Indiana had when they brought a lot of players back and a lot of continuity. So I'm not concerned. And I also think that, just because I think people forget this at times as well, just because, and I'm picking him out of, I'm not saying I know anything about him one way or the other, but like just because Malik Renew is in the portal does not mean he's gone. It just means he's in the portal and looking at his options.
Right.
And it could be that Indiana is his best option. It could be that it's not. Now, for some people in the portal, I think people understand like, oh, that's probably a he's gone signal. But I think for a lot of guys, it's just testing waters, or it's also, you see this in pro sports all the time. You're going like Miles Turner will be a free agent. He's going to take other offers and be like, I really want to play in Indiana. So here are the better offers, match it or beat it. And it's very possible, players are doing that as well. So it's just part of the process. And I think it's funny people who are freaking out about like, oh my God, we got to get guys today. It's like, but I mean, more importantly, those are players who didn't get us in the tournament. And we have a coach now who did literally this 12 months ago.
And, I think ultimately you have to understand that a lot of what we knew about college basketball and a lot of the way that it is conceptualized has been around, it's kind of similar to what we see with football, where so much of it is conceptualized around this idea of, well, you bring players in and you develop them in this system, and then they gradually get to where they need to get to, and you get to follow along with their journeys. I'm sure there are people that have actually done that. I think there's a lot of people who say that they've done that, but don't really have the history of having done that. And I think what we've seen, especially in the last couple of years, is it is in no way, shape, or form a requirement that you have a core of players that have been in one spot that play for 3 or 4 years together to get to a point where they can compete for a title. It's a great narrative. It's a great thing to put in our heads. And I do think that it was the only thing that you could really do historically. Like you couldn't just go get transfers every year. Now you can. And I think what we're seeing is more and more, and we kind of already knew this with the one and done situation that had become the norm for the Kentuckys and the Dukes of the world. But you can assemble a championship caliber team essentially overnight.
Yeah.
You can bring people in from elsewhere. You can mix them with people that are there or that were in other places entirely. And you can put together a coherent roster that can do a lot of great things. And it's your job as coaches, if you're coaching for those teams, to get that group to coalesce in a way that's going to allow them to be dominant throughout the course of the season. We saw
there was even a meme going around Twitter on the Sweet 16. It's like, where did the starting 5 players play the season before? And like the mash of colleges, like you had me and some friends were going through it. It's like you could find Purdue and Michigan State, and then everybody else. It was like I think I don't know who that team is. I don't know who that. I mean, it was just literally the 5 colleges the starters played in the year before, and there were some teams where it's impossible to tell.
Yeah, and look, I just my perspective on it is pretty straightforward. You've got to adapt to where things are at, and if you can still do we're going to recruit guys, get them to stay, not have them get into the portal, and slowly develop them and then plug them in, great. But I heard a lot of people when that graphic was making the rounds talk about, like somehow what Izzo or Painter was doing was superior, and it's not. It's not that it's any worse, but it's no better.
Right.
It's just another way of going about it, and it's a very tight line to try to walk. I mean, Purdue's a great example. They lose a guy in Mason Gillis who was the 6th most efficient player offensively in the entirety of college basketball last year. He transfers to Duke, and he hasn't played that much this year. I don't know that he got minutes at all in that game last night against who did they play? Alabama. He may have, but it's he got 6 minutes and did not score and had 1 assist and 1 foul. I mean, that's a big loss. Purdue's done a really good job of finding complementary pieces and putting them in, but even they brought in a transfer every once in a while. So my point is, if you're Indiana, you really did need to hit the reset button on this roster. You really needed to try to coordinate a new approach to putting a team together, not just because you want to bring in players that can play Darren DeVries' system, but clearly the way that Indiana tried to assemble their roster over the last couple of years was not working. It hadn't worked sufficiently. Last year was this kind of amalgamation of a couple of big portal ads, but still a core of guys that had been around. And while they had some individual moments of success, realistically speaking, it just wasn't a mix that worked. Indiana missed the NCAA tournament again, despite having a kind of a halfway in approach to doing this. Rarely do you shuffle the deck entirely on a roster when a coach is there, but I think when you bring a new coach in, as we've seen in a bunch of different places across college basketball, West Virginia last year under Darren DeVries is a great example. Obviously, we've talked about Louisville. We've talked about several of these other schools that were very good this year. Kentucky was another one. Arkansas was one. You look at what Arkansas was able to do, getting all the way to the Sweet 16 with a new coach and a new roster. So, yes, it's a different approach than what we're used to, but it is, again, one that we just saw happen in football. And it's not that the returning players for IU didn't contribute. There were some, like Omar Cooper, that really contributed in very major ways. But the heart and soul of that team was elsewhere. And it wasn't just at James Madison. It was at Wake Forest, or it was at Texas Tech, or it was at some of those other places. So don't let it get you too distracted, and don't listen to the headlines, which are really just out there to kind of jar people and get them to pay attention. I think that everything's going according to schedule.
Well, and the two other things I would say is that, first off, and I have not looked, so forgive me for saying this, but I think this is a fair statement. Sometimes we get into our own bubble of Indiana. We'll talk about Willard leaving Maryland. I'm not sure what it's going to look like, but Maryland will probably have something similar where they'll lose a lot of the players. There's been coach movement. Normally when a coach leaves, most of the players go in the portal. So it is jarring to see no Indiana players on the roster right now. And it's like, oh my God, this really isn't just us. Other teams will probably have down to one or two players left on the roster when a coach leaves and you hire a new coach. I'm also, but it also is, this is, whether you like it or not, this is the way that college basketball is run. And it's so much different than even, I'm looking back to Tom Crean's first year in 2009, where you had another reset, maybe less one that you wanted to do. But looking at that first roster he put together, you had Devin Dumas, who was a junior. And I forget, he was a transfer, like Vincennes, or I forget where he was. But then the rest of the roster, Verdell Jones, Malik Story, Pritchard, Nick Williams, Daniel Moore, Matt Roth, were all freshmen. Just that was how it had to be done at that point, where it's just, we got to get a bunch of recruits. And, there was no other. Brent Finkelmeyer was returning. I think Kyle Tabor was returning, a senior and a sophomore. The only person you got was Devin Dumas out of the so-called transfer portal in 2009. That wasn't, it was that long ago. It doesn't feel that long ago for those of us in our 40s, but it's just, it's a different era. It's a different, way that the game is managed. It's just funny to look back at that.
And it's better now if you have to make a change. And that is where you can put pieces together relatively quickly, as I think we've talked about. Speaking of the pieces, so Indiana right now is in the mix for a bunch of different folks. I'm going to put a link into the Substack for those of you that are out there. Tony Adrani has done a great job of putting together a website called iuoffseason.com. And it tracks not just perceived interest in the portal or expressed interest in the portal for players, but it's also got assistant coaching candidates up there as well. And it's a really handy resource. Now, I think
for Tony with that, finding that URL, that's a great URL pull.
Well, I think he's a very resourceful guy. Yeah. I tip my cap to him on that. Yeah. And still kind of in the preliminary stages, and you are seeing a few players commit. I think it was Donovan Dent from New Mexico that just committed to UCLA. That was a pretty big money offer. There's a couple of other guys out there that I think we'll see commit early. There's a couple that were in the mix yesterday, but IU is certainly behind the scenes discussing things with people and trying to bring them in. And a lot of people have expressed concern about the lack of an assistant coach announcement. But as we heard, I think through Zach Osterman, they're planning on making all those announcements at once. So, for instance, like, allegedly there was a potential assistant coach with Darren DeVries at the IHSAA boys basketball finals yesterday. It's looking more and more likely that that person might end up being on staff. And we've had some shifts. Like yesterday, there was an announcement that Corey Barnett, who was on DeVries' staff at West Virginia and obviously former IU player, and I think was maybe director of player development at one point for IU, or was at the very least a grad assistant, got the Oral Roberts head coaching job. So he's probably out of the mix. But there's a lot of folks among the group of coaches that have either just finished coaching or will be soon that are in the mix as far as coming in. So I think sometime this week we will likely hear the announcement of who the assistant coaches are going to be, and it's likely going to be some combination of guys that were with DeVries at West Virginia and guys that are at other programs that are now seriously looking at coming to IU because of the increased prestige and money that goes along with being at IU. And so that's going to be an interesting thing to watch, and that will certainly affect the players that come in. And this is where I think, it's like a two-step process. Obviously, the head coach is dictating who he wants to get in the portal, the type of player, but the assistant coaches are often the way in which you get certain players who might not otherwise think about coming to your school to come to your school. Because you see this, like we know from even the past couple of staffs, like the relationships that assistant coaches are able to build, not just amongst players that are in high school right now, but players that were recruited and maybe you're looking to go somewhere else. Like all of that is kind of in the mix as far as who you're going to be able to attract and bring in. And so it's an interesting process. Now, Tony right now has 5 players.
One thing on the coaching, I'll just
go ahead.
Just one other thought to get everyone kind of calm down is it is again jarring, but we don't have any assistant coaches. Well, first off, I'm sure DeVries isn't just like, oh, wow, I forgot to do that. Like, I guess I can't go into the season no assistant coaches. Like, he will get that figured out. But the second thing is, you and I have lived through enough bad seasons. In Crean's last year, there was a lot of talk about, man, Crean is not doing X, Y, and Z. There was nobody was like, man, his third assistant is really screwing this up. Last year under Woodson, it's under Woodson. Like, you just say that out loud, and it's like, Woodson wasn't doing this, Woodson wasn't doing that. Like, once you get into the season, unless you're super wonky, nobody is ever thinking like, man, that Woodson's doing a bang up job. It's assistants who suck. Like, it's one of these things, like they will become kind of part of the tapestry of everything. And it's again, something to be concerned about at this very point in time. But I guarantee for most people, probably myself included, if in 2 years you ask me to name all of the assistants on IU basketball staff, I won't be able to do it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of little things like that to think about, and ultimately the assistants are very important. It's just that they're part of a holistic group that is trying to get things done, and so I'm very curious to see what the staff looks like. It's likely going to be, with maybe one exception, a whole new, fresh group of names, which again is not that unusual given the history of coaching changes and what we see coming in, not just here, but elsewhere. I mean, you're going to get a new regime, so to speak. It's like a president getting hired and bringing in all of their own new cabinet members. So the players that we're keeping an eye on, and again, I would go to Tony's site for information on this. Obviously, Tucker DeVries, assuming he gets the waiver, which he almost certainly will, is going to be at IU.
I wish that Tony would have put him in like a home visit section. It's
right.
Like, where was the visit, Tony? Was it a Zoom? Like, I love it. It was a Zoom visit. Like, hey, Tucker, go to the other room. Sorry.
We met at a breakfast place. It was my kitchen. Yes. Yeah. But some other names that have popped up that are of interest. Connor Enright, the junior point guard from DePaul, who was injured most of last year, but prior to that had played for Darren DeVries at Drake, is on the list, and he's got a visit scheduled. Actually, that visit's happening, I think, on Tuesday of this upcoming week. Some other names that have been tossed around: Ryan Conwell, junior from Indianapolis, who played at Xavier, was a very good player for Xavier this year. Josh Dix at Iowa has been mentioned. Isaac McNeely, who's a 6'4" guard from Virginia, has been mentioned. And there'll be some other names that pop up as well. And the timetable on this, there's a kind of an open question about how these deals are going to get done. We talked about this with Zach Osterman a couple of weeks ago about the deadline for the house settlement, which is going to change the way that these deals are evaluated post approval of that settlement, if it happens, and that the approval would happen on Monday, the 7th of April. So we're talking about 8 days from when we're recording this today. You know, the idea that you'd want to get players signed because there's less scrutiny on their NIL deals before that deadline, that's kind of been the going thought process. Now, there's also the possibility that you could have some backdating of contracts and things like that, which of course always happens in these circumstances, or that the deadline gets pushed forward to the end of the portal cycle, because I could see people suing, saying, well, this is unfair and arbitrary. Unfair and arbitrary and the NCAA, those two things have never been in the same sentence before. So, you know, but I think it's important to note, as has been pointed out by several folks over the course of the last couple of weeks, the timeline for a lot of the signings last year at places like West Virginia, Louisville, was actually in the April 20th range or later.
Right.
And that's not surprising, because, you know, players want to go around, they want to listen to offers, they want to see where they fit within systems, they got to wait for pieces to fall into place. And we've still got coaching changes that are happening right now. You know, we saw Sean Miller go from Xavier to Texas, and we saw, you know, Richard Pitino go from New Mexico to Xavier, and then New Mexico still got to hire somebody, and they're kind of a minor player in the game. Willard is going to Villanova, which now means Maryland's going to be open. So who do they go get? You know, if they get an assistant, that doesn't change things quite as much, but it changes things a little bit if you've got recruits that are tied to that assistant that we're going to go with them and maybe go elsewhere. So all of that means that the timeline may be a little bit delayed, and there may be players who are like, well, I'm going to roll the dice that whatever evaluation of my NIL money I might be having to receive as a result of the settlement probably won't be up and running in time for it to really matter. And if there is something, I'll just sue and probably win. So,
no, and that's honestly, that's where my mind has kind of gone as I thought about this. When I initially listened to your and Zach's pod, I was like, oh man, like that is going to be, everyone's going to want to sign by that date. But then if you take a step back, you know, players like, and I'll just pick, Josh Dix from Iowa. It's like, he wants, the person probably wants to go to 5 or 6 schools and either have Zoom meetings or on-campus meetings and see how he fits. And you can't do that in a matter of 3 days, and maybe one of the schools he wants to go to is still playing, or they just finished playing, or maybe one is, hiring a coach, like you said, and I think if you're a player, it's like, yeah, I might be able to know that my NIL deal is completely lock solid. But the other thing is, if I believe mine is kind of somewhat market value, like who cares? Like I'll take it. And by the way, half this stuff has always, who's going to evaluate that? How is it going to happen? Like those are all open questions. It's not like this is like an NBA free agency deadline where we know there's a commissioner with a true deadline. So I think a lot of people, as always, are going to act in their own personal best interest, which is, maybe I won't maximize my absolute value, but I'd much rather be in the right situation for me and be the place I want to play at.
right.
And then roll the dice that maybe, 10% of my money becomes held up or something. But it's not like you're either getting paid or not getting paid. It's just a matter of, are you going to be able to get something that's over market value? And then even is that something that's logically going to happen? So I think it's going to be much later than that. I just think that deadline is going to come and go, and it's not going to drive a lot of people to decision points. Because if I was a player, I'd want to make sure I'm playing in the right place, not just can I get the absolute most for my money and then be stuck at a place where I hate.
I mean, or you could probably do both. I think the idea that you have to sacrifice the location because you're worried about the deadline is probably a little overstated. I do think, as we've seen, there's some back channel deals that have already taken place. Like, for instance, to me, it seems very implausible that Donovan Dent had his coach leave and then within a day and a half was able to figure out, where I really want to go? UCLA. And UCLA, which has notoriously struggled for NIL money, just happened to have $2 million around where they were like, here you go.
Yeah.
I doubt that that's how it worked. And so a lot of this stuff is stuff that's already conversed about. There might be, personal appearances for appearance purposes. There might be legitimate negotiations going on. But it's,
well, again, in the professionalization, like this is always makes me crack up. The first day of NBA free agency, It's like there's like 35 contracts. Like, oh, this got figured out. It's like all of this got figured out in the first 3 minutes. Like, really? You're telling me that like you figured out a 3-year, $25 million deal in the first 8 minutes of free agency?
Yeah, it doesn't seem plausible. And again, that's a good way of thinking about it. And is now, the one complication here is who's bringing you to where you're going, and do they move? Because again, it's not just head coaches that are changing jobs and tied to players. It's assistant coaches that are tied to players that are also changing jobs. And I mean, if you look at the assistant coaching candidates that have been bandied about for Indiana, there's Big 12 assistant coaches in the mix. There's SEC assistant coaches in the mix. And some of them are still playing. Some of them may have just gotten done, but as they look to move and they're doing negotiations, it has a lot of downstream effects. And so it's just, to me, it's fascinating. I don't know how much longer we're going to have this system. I'm not saying I like this system, but I do find it fascinating trying to track it all, because it ends up being this flurry of activity that happens in a relatively short period of time. And it affects like all of the different levels of what happens on the floor, from the head coach to the assistant coaches to the strength and conditioning coaches, all the way down to the players.
Yeah.
All we know with Indiana is that they're going to have to coalesce around a brand new style. And this is why I wasn't surprised to see all of the players go into the portal, except for Luke Goody, who's still waiting on his waiver and we assume would still be around. But, you go through the rest of the players. I mean, it took Bryson Tucker, I think, until Friday to get into the portal. But earlier in the week, we had seen Mackenzie Mbako get into the portal. We had seen Miles Rice.
Right.
And, some folks have been like, oh, it would have been nice to have had that person in the mix to see what they could do. For others, it was like, well, not really going to miss perhaps the way that person played. You always, I think with coaches, it's not just about, at this point, does the player fit my system? But going back to your salary cap question, or the way that these free agency things are done, you have to think about how much money do I have to play with, and then how much of those resources are going to be utilized in this particular type of player. So we'll take like a Miles Rice as an example. Is Miles Rice going to be the starting point guard in Darren DeVries' system? Probably not, given his particular skill set. It would be a roll of the dice if he was going to be the starter or maybe just a backup, which is kind of what he ended up being on this IU team this year. Well, if you're paying, let's just pull a number out of the air. Let's say $1 million.
Well, the thing with returning players is that, unlike the new players, which is a little more, you can kind of pick your number. Like Miles Rice had a number this year. I don't know what it is, but he was paid something this year. Right. So if you're Miles Rice, like you don't want to take a demotion. Like right. Well, you're going to want more than what you wanted, and it may not be that is what the market needs, what DeVries wants to pay.
That was the point I was trying to make. Thank you for making it for me. But no, the idea is if you paid that guy a certain amount, even if your total percentage of money available is going to go up, is that player worth it in your system to take up that much of your salary cap, even though it's not a salary cap? But whatever your budget is this player worth that amount of money, or do you have better value? I mean, this is where, one of the things about Moneyball that people forget about, like most people with Moneyball in baseball focus on, okay, it's about, getting on base rather than trying to hit home runs, or it's about, we're not doing starting pitching that's going a long time. We're using a ton of relievers because fresh arms are always more effective in the long run, the statistical, the long run. With basketball, it's not a whole lot different, in as much as it's not necessarily about let's go get the best players. It's about let's get the players that best contribute to the whole within the budgetary amount that they might be worth. So if you're going to have 2 or 3 players on your roster that are probably going to be your high earners, right, and then you're going to have a bunch of other players that you need to fill roles. Where can you get players where you can get them for a certain amount of money so that it all adds up to the number you're looking at? Not let's just go get the best available players and then figure out what to do with them later. Because as we saw, like with Rutgers this year, Rutgers goes out, gets 2 guys in Ace Bailey and Dylan Harper, who are clearly awesome players. They had no money to re-sign Cliff O'Marooney or any of the other guys or go out and get other players. So they ended up incredibly top-heavy because their roster was, the money on their roster was all consumed in a couple of guys, and you can't win basketball games that way. We see that in the NBA a lot too. Badly constructed rosters, to have multiple superstars on your squad requires you to go significantly above and beyond. Now, Indiana is very fortunate in that Indiana will have the amount of money that's needed to go get a couple of superstars and pair them with a really well fleshed out roster. If they manage their money correctly, they will be in better shape than, say, Iowa, who notoriously this year did not spend very much money on NIL, had to really scramble. Allegedly that was one of the reasons why Darren DeVries came to IU, was that they weren't going to be able to come close to matching NIL in basketball. It is hypothetically one of the reasons why Kevin Willard is leaving Maryland, because there's two different levels of money that you're talking about here. You've got revenue share money, and that is $22 million max can be spent on NIL, in air quotes, money going to players. You don't have to spend all $22 million, but that's the number that you can get to. And most of the serious programs with basketball and football and Division I athletics in general are going to have to spend all $22 million. But then it becomes, what's your percentage breakdown of how you're parsing that money out to people? And so a school like Iowa is going to look at it and say, well, we're going to give most of our money to football because that's the sport that's most successful. We're going to give some of it to wrestling because that's important to us. At Maryland, it's well, football kind of is the most important thing there from a revenue perspective because they make more money at football than they do at other sports. And they've got, they've had historically some financial issues budgetarily throughout that athletic department. So you take all that into account. Indiana's having to walk a tightrope in terms of well, how are we going to do our percentage splits? But then that's where the second bucket comes in, which is the amount of NIL money that you can give to players on top of that. And Indiana's in really good shape. Probably far better shape than Maryland or Iowa. And they're up in that echelon with the Louisvilles, the Dukes, the Kentuckys. So that's the atmosphere that Indiana's got to play in. So you got to be smart about it. And then it really becomes a matter of, again, how are we taking all of those financial resources and intelligently utilizing them to make sure that where we're going is competitive with the rest of the top of college basketball?
Yeah, you don't want to be the Phoenix Suns where you have 3 highly paid players. And no, it's funny. We've talked a lot about the NBA today, but it is very much the way that you have to kind of frame your view of college athletics. The two things I'll take from that is that, one, this is always something that in the NBA is Bradley Beal's not a bad player. If you don't know who he is, he's a shooting guard on the Suns, but his contract is he's getting paid $68 million a year or some absurd number. And it's he's getting paid way more than as good as he is. Yeah. And that becomes a real problem for a team when you're paying somebody LeBron James money, but you're not getting LeBron James production. And you see a lot of that in the NBA where, people just sit there and rail on guys. It's the guy's not a bad player. It's just his contract is out of whack with what he's providing. I think you're going to start seeing some of that in college sports. The question I have for you that I find interesting is I understand there's schools that have larger alumni bases and have been more connected, but it's interesting to me how many schools, even within the Big Ten that has Big Ten network money, seem to be getting caught flat-footed by this. You mentioned Iowa. Maryland is in a good market. They have Under Armour as a sponsor. They've had relatively pretty high level success in both basketball and football. They seem to be struggling with this. Minnesota is a different case, but they're struggling. I just find it interesting, and maybe it's just how well positioned Indiana was for this, but just how many schools in a big power conference. Because my view is always, and maybe I'm just wrong, was that Big Ten and SEC are just going to go light years ahead of everybody else because they have so much more money coming in from TV networks. And maybe that will be the case over time. It strikes me as odd that right now it looks like a good number of Big Ten teams were just, I'll say it again, caught flat-footed.
Well, I mean, I don't know how much of it is being caught flat-footed as much as it is trying to take in the realities of your school's
station.
Not just, well, no, that wasn't where I was going. What is your school value? What are the boosters value? What is it that you're making money off of? Where do you need to make money off of it? So, let's take Minnesota as an example. Minnesota has not given a lot of NIL resources, and you would think with as many alums as Minnesota has, 60,000 students there every year, and it's literally the flagship school for the entirety of a big state, like a state with a lot of business, with a lot of really successful alums. But, I think for them, like, they're looking at it and they say, well, we've got football, which is really important because we generate yes, but we've also got hockey. Hockey's incredibly important. Hockey's a title contending team at Minnesota. Well, are you going to short what hockey gets in NIL so that basketball, which has not been historically successful unless it cheats, is that where you put your money?
It's funny and true. Just like, it's a great point.
So what they're talking about, I was just reading this in Sports Business Journal earlier this month. They're talking about $5 to $6 million for basketball combined, revenue sharing and NIL deals. That's not a lot of money. I mean, Indiana, you're talking about 10 million plus. Louisville's talking about that category. So this is less like the NBA where there's a soft salary cap, but everybody's more or less within a general range. It's not as much like the NFL, which has a quasi-hard salary cap. It's really a soft cap too, but everybody's more or less within the same range. This is more like baseball, where you could have teams that are doubling the amount of money that's being spent by somebody else in their conference. And as we've seen in baseball, just because you don't have that much money doesn't mean you can't put together a successful team that plays hard and that wins games. But I think it's like, if you aren't restricted by that, don't do it. Like, don't say, well, we're not going to spend that much money on NIL. You've got to get out in that space, because ultimately basketball, perhaps more than any other sport, you are reliant on having good players go out and play the game. You can't necessarily strategize your way to a victory. This is one of the big misconceptions about how this stuff works. You get an occasional team that will ride the wave of a really good system, and they'll be competitive to a certain point. But as we're seeing in this NCAA tournament, increasingly, you have to have a team where there's a lot of talent, and that talent's going to cost you money. So I look at Maryland. It's like Maryland's had its budgetary issues. It's what led them to join the Big Ten in the first place. Football is going to be a primary methodology by which they increase revenue. So how much money are you willing to spend on basketball when it may not move the needle in a way that football will? Indiana's in a unique spot because they've got good revenue flows coming in from both now that football had that very successful season last year. So there's a little of balance there, but then you got to try to make up for that balance by getting NIL money in to help out with that over-the-top payment that you might need to bring a player who might be looking elsewhere. It's not the only factor, but it's something you've got to think about. And so this is why you've seen a lot of schools go to this general manager model, right, where someone's got to be able to think about, how does all this fit within the confines of what we can do financially? Coaches may not have that capacity. I mean, it's a different skill set. And I think I mentioned this in the podcast I did at the beginning of the week, Scott, but remember there was this time period in the 90s and the 2000s where head coaches in the NFL and the NBA were arguing that they should also be making the player personnel decisions. And
I'm going to make dinner, I got to pick the groceries, whatever.
Yeah, if I'm going to do the cooking, I should be allowed to buy the groceries, which was Bill Parcells' statement. When they drafted Terry Glenn, who he didn't want. He didn't want to draft a receiver in the first round. But the flip side of that is, as we saw with Bill Belichick later on in his career, coaches aren't always great at drafts. Coaches aren't always great at understanding how things fit within the salary cap. Well, right, exactly. Yeah,
Patino, the Celtics, just
And so if you look at what like the Eagles have done over the course of the last several years and how effectively they have built their roster and maintained their roster. That's Howie Roseman. That's not Nick Sirianni doing that.
Right.
It wasn't, Doug Peterson doing it before. As an institution, and I think this is where a lot of colleges and universities have to get to, and this is where I think some of them are falling behind, and it's where I think you got to tip your cap to Indiana. They figured this out relatively early. Your athletics, like your coaching personnel, are not necessarily going to be the ones that have that knowledge and understanding. Not that they don't understand the game, but they may not understand how the numbers work and how you have to fit all these things together, because it is complicated and it's really hard to effectively delineate what you feel about a player versus what the numbers say that you should be doing with a player as far as their roster spot. That's where I'm really curious how IU is going to navigate this, because they don't have a GM right now. And I think, as you know, we heard this was talked about in that interview with Darren DeVries that Pete Yonkman did for Hoosiers Connect, which I recommend everybody go watch. You've got to make decisions about what that person's job is. Like, how does that overlap with everything that's going on? I think where Indiana's in good shape is that they've got an infrastructure that goes beyond just the coaching staff that can think about these things. It's a difficult dance, and it also requires a lot of money coming in from elsewhere and knowing how to manage all of that. So it's just, there's a lot there. And I think it's fortunate that Indiana was in a position where they had already thought through a lot of these things, and a lot of schools didn't, either because they didn't want to, or they assumed that they were going to be able to manage it in some way that was going to be easier than what it's going to be. The way it's going to have to be managed is pretty complicated.
I also think for a football program that has just been historically unlucky for years, I do think this is one area where Indiana was just wildly lucky, in that if you take the coaching out of it, just put historical context of, like, an 11-1 season, you plop it at any point in the history of IU football. If it happened in 2004, let's just say DiNardo comes in and we go, 11-1 and go to the Sugar Bowl or something, and then it just kind of dips down. Like, if that happened, then people would have been fired up. But by now, maybe they would just be like, football can't ever get it done. Like, the fact that it happened this year, where, Indiana's obviously going to always financially support basketball, number one, or that's not going to be a hard pull to get money from donors for basketball. Football would have been tough. But the fact they popped right at this time, now it's very easy to say, hey, remember how you're already going to give $100 for basketball. Remember how awesome that football season was? Give $100 for football too. That's a super easy push. And now, hopefully that allows another good football season, which then people will start to get the, I'm going to double donate, versus, like you were saying, Maryland, which has just been kind of, I don't mean this as a knock, kind of mid in both. I mean, they've had little ups and downs. They haven't had a Final Four in the last 15 years. They didn't go to a high level BCS game. And it's like, kind of like, all right, well, if Indiana was just pumping along at 7-win seasons after 20 years, you'd be like, all right, I'm not. Anyway, it's just, my point is, I think that Indiana football hitting when it did is the perfect time, right when it's like, we need to throw jet fuel in the form of money into this NIL thing. And it allows the donors to kind of lock into both.
For a historically unsuccessful program, I mean, you'd rather have that success now. Yes. Right. But ultimately, it really does come down to, outside of the revenue sharing process, where is the money coming from? Where are the donors? Can you get people excited? And as much as I wouldn't trade the sudden ramp up in success in football for anything. I actually think the best time would have been like 10 years ago, because, and to some degree, Indiana's lucky that they got what relative level of success they had in the last 10 years, where at least got football on people's radar as something Indiana could be successful in. But look, you're going to be behind the eight ball from that perspective for a long time,
right?
With you've got to deal with the Ohio States and the Marylands and the Penn States, or not the Maryland, the Ohio States and the Michigans and the Penn States, but also you've got to deal with Iowas and the Michigan States, like, where it's really culturally important, and therefore it's easy to get donors to give money. Where I think it's all going to have to come to a head, though, and this is going to be a really fascinating thing to watch, is I just don't know how much longer donors are going to be willing to shell out millions of dollars a year on top of what the schools are shelling out to pay the salaries of athletes coming in and playing. Like, at some point, you got to ask yourself, why aren't the schools paying all of this? And why are we funding so much of it through donations? Right now, it's artificially inflated some of this value, where you've got a guy going from New Mexico to UCLA who's going to be making like $2+ million, and a decent amount of that's going to be donor money. Well, at some point, donors are going to be like, how much is your television contract again? How much are you guys making in ticket revenue? And look, we've talked many times about how athletic departments are not built for profit. They're built as nonprofits. So it's not like they've got a bunch of cash in reserve, but they're also spending a lot of cash on things that I'm sure for a lot of donors, they're going to be like, I don't really understand why you guys are spending $5 million a year on a compliance office to comply with NCAA rules that largely don't exist anymore. I don't understand why you're paying all of this extra money to maintain sports that don't generate any money, but you're paying like $2 million a year for, a fencing team, maybe not $2 million a year, or an equestrian team. Like, why is that acceptable? And yet my checks are going to pay for basketball players and football players. I do think there's going to come a point where that's going to be a really key issue that gets brought up. And you're going to have some schools that will go back to the well, and the well will be dry in terms of the donor money, because I just don't know that this is a sustainable model.
No, I completely agree. The other piece that I've said many times, but I think is also going to have to be changed, and this is just back to something you've talked about. It's like sometimes colleges don't know the business they're in. Having season tickets for both IU basketball and the Pacers, the treatment of me as a season ticket holder is wildly different from the two organizations. And at some point, the universities are going to have to realize, like, they're selling this, and we're customers. We're not just donors, and it's not just, oh, I love to give money to IU because I graduated there, and walking into assembly halls or religious experience. At some point, it's like, hey, I'm giving you money so I can watch a good basketball team. And the Pacers understand that, like, it is a business relationship, and they understand that. And when times are tough and the Pacers aren't good, when Paul George broke his leg, I suddenly got a lot of free stuff, and I got a lot of attention, but as the Pacers have gotten better, like, they're not forgetting me, but it's definitely like, it's not like, hey, we'll give you free tickets here or parking there. Like, it's changed, and I understand it. And I know that if the Pacers suck again, I will get better offer. Like, but they have like 200 ticket reps that work for the Pacers. That is all their job is to keep me happy and to keep me buying tickets. And you don't have that in universities. And I do wonder if that's a shift that's going to have to happen as well. Understanding this is way more of a business relationship than just I love being an alumnus and giving money.
Yep. All of that is true. And I am going to be fascinated to see how it all works out, because it is going to change the relationship between fans and the athletic departments that are out there. It's going to change the relationship between donors. And this is why you keep hearing about things like private equity in college sports. And it's why you keep hearing about, like, all these other items. It gets cast as greed, and there's greed involved. Don't get me wrong. But it's also, we've created essentially a second-tier professional league in basketball and football that has to be paid for in some way.
It's funded by donations right now.
So, last thing I wanted to touch on the podcast today, this has been noted a couple of different places, but if you look at the KenPom ratings and the efficiency ratings for the teams that are remaining in the tournament as of this morning, six of the top 7 teams in KenPom are in the remaining 6 teams in the NCAA tournament. There's a very good chance that we're going to end up with the 4 top teams in KenPom being the 4 teams in the Final Four. I touched on this a little bit in the podcast earlier in the week about how this is not an accident.
Right.
This idea that the teams that are at the top of those efficiency metrics are going to be the teams that are competing for titles. You look down the list, like the highest ranked team that lasted the longest was kind of a tie between a couple different ones. Mississippi was 20th, Michigan was 22nd, but really the teams that were clustered around the very top of the net efficiency ratings are the ones that are still standing. And those teams are significantly better than what we've seen from the last several years. And it's not just a matter of talent coalescing, although that is part of it. It's also a stylistic decision-making process that's happening on the part of coaches to play in a hyper-efficient style. And this is where, as much as there was back and forth about the different aspects of the Woodson era that people would argue, like I remember arguing, and as many people pointed out, like, we're not shooting threes very well. And I can remember somebody clapping back on Twitter that claimed to have inside sources on things like, well, there's more than one way to win in basketball today. And it's like, well, that's true, but you're also really tying your hand behind your back or both hands behind your back if you're not playing in a style that maximizes your offensive efficiency. And if you look at the 6 teams currently left, they're all in the top 25 in offensive efficiency. And if you look at the 6 teams that are left, they're all in the top 10 of defensive efficiency. And so you're seeing an interesting thing happening here where Houston's a great example of a team that had to make adjustments. Like, they've kind of skirted this situation in terms of how are we playing and how effective are we on both ends of the ball or both ends of the court. And from their approach to things, it's really been, continuing to maintain that efficient offense. They're never going to, the way that they play, probably get higher than 12th or 10th. But the fact they can play so much good defense allows that net efficiency rating to maintain a very high level. This is where I think this was probably my biggest frustration overall with not just Mike Woodson, but also with Archie Miller and also with Tom Crean, where in the last 15 years of Indiana basketball, there's been 1 year when Indiana finished in the top 20 of both offensive and defensive efficiency. And that was the 2013 team. And, they were second in the country in offensive efficiency. They were 19th in defensive efficiency. Ever since then, Crean had a couple of teams that were wildly good offensively and really average to poor defensively. And then since then, Indiana's rarely like that. Since that point, since the 2016 team stopped playing, Indiana hasn't been top 20 in either offensive or defensive efficiency in any season. The closest they've come, they were 24th in defensive efficiency the first year that Woodson was here, and they were 36th in defensive efficiency this year. Not good enough, especially when in those seasons, you're 95th in offensive efficiency in 2022, and you're 67th in offensive efficiency in 2025. My point in all this is one of the things that's attractive about Darren DeVries as a head coach, and obviously we still have to see how it's done, but this is a guy who at different times in his career has coached really good offenses and really good defenses. To have the 33rd best offensive efficiency at Drake is a real accomplishment given the low level of recruiting that you're able to do there. To have the 15th most efficient defense in the country at West Virginia is impressive, especially when you lose two key players early on to injury. Obviously, we need to see him do this at the IU level, but this has got to be where Indiana and a bunch of these other schools really focus, because clearly Bruce Pearl, John Shire, Todd Golden, Kelvin Sampson, like these are coaches that have figured out how to merge these things together. And it's going to be an interesting race next year, Scott, because outside of the very top teams, there's very few other teams that you would look at and say that coach has figured it out. Like a lot of teams were really good in one area and not good in the other. So like Texas A&M this year, 9th in defensive efficiency, but 40th in offensive efficiency. That didn't work. Illinois was the inverse, 14th in offense, 40th in defense. You're going to have a hard cap on what you can do in terms of your progression as a program until you can figure out both. And I think that it's the unfortunate thing about both the Archie Miller and Mike Woodson eras is like you just kind of felt there was a hard cap on what they could do because neither of them seemed to really value the level of efficiency you need across the board to be successful in college basketball at this point.
You're so right on. And what's frustrating is, this isn't something that is like newly figured out. I just went back in time and this kind of holds true no matter what. I just picked a year in random, 2008. The Final Four was North Carolina, Kansas, Memphis, and UCLA. All four of those teams were top 7 offensive efficiency and top 14 defensive. That's only because North Carolina was 14th. Kansas, Memphis, and UCLA were 1st, 2nd, and 5th in defensive efficiency. And I'll note North Carolina lost in the first game of the Final Four. So your final teams were all basically in the top 10 of both offensive and defensive efficiency. And I was kind of just plugging around in years. You see pretty much the same thing every single year over the last 20, 25 years. So this isn't like, oh, Bruce Pearl just figured this out 2 years ago. It's kind of been sitting there the entire time. It's just, I think teams are starting to figure out how do I create teams that meet these metrics? But really, teams are doing that before. It's just I don't think we were following those metrics enough.
Well, and I guess I'll put it this way: like Bruce Pearl, that's a great example. Like these last 2 years were the first time in Bruce Pearl's career that he had a team that was in the top 20 of both offensive efficiency and defensive efficiency. He had a couple of teams like the Final Four team that Auburn had. They were 6th in the country in offensive efficiency, but they were 36th defensively. If you go and look at Tom Izzo as an example and look at what he's done, like he's had teams that have been in those high metrics. It's not something that you can just automatically do. You have to have the right mix of players. You have to be able to bring in the right sorts of players and plug them in effectively and get them playing in the right style. So it's both a stylistic choice and a roster decision choice. And some of it's luck, but a lot of it is like how many you get more bites at the apple if you've already got a system in place that is set up for efficiency.
Right.
And that was always the big issue with Woodson's approach in both offense and defense. Like the offense really could only be efficient if they had a guy like Trace Jackson Davis, who was a hyper efficient scorer himself, who, made a lot of shots, got to the free throw line and made a lot of free throws. Like you've got to have someone who's in the upper ranges of that aspect of things. And then defensively, you have to have a system that really creates problems for the opposition. If you look at Houston, like what's been the key to Houston's success this year? They're 4th in the country in opponent field goal percentage. They make it very hard to shoot twos. They're 5th in the country in 2-point percentage. And if you watched any Houston games in the tournament, you understand why. Like it's like going up against the defensive line in football. Every time you go into the paint, they're very, very hard to play against. They also force a ton of turnovers. They don't, and this is the interesting thing, they're not good at everything. Like they don't particularly care if they're putting you on the free throw line because it's not having an outsized impact on the level of defensive efficiency they're playing overall. If you look at, let's say, Tennessee, what's been the key for them? They don't force a ton of turnovers, but they are also really good at limiting effective field goal percentage. They're great at getting blocks, and they don't send the other team to the free throw line. So for them, it's like their trade-off is, well, we're not going to be as dogged on ball trying to force turnovers like Houston is, but instead we're not going to foul. We're just going to play really solid defense. Neither of those teams particularly cares that much about giving up offensive rebounds as well, because again, it doesn't really have that much of a negative impact. I think with IU, when you look at what they tried to do defensively during Woodson's tenure, people complained about the nail slot rim situation and how it would surrender 3-point shots. Indiana was never awful in the 3-point percentage that they would surrender. The worst that they were was last year, not this past year, but the year before, where they were 211th in the country. But where Indiana really struggled was they were just kind of okay at like holding opponents' shooting percentages down. They never really focused on turnovers, but they weren't great in any of the other metrics that go into good, efficient defensive play. So this is where this new roster build is going to be fascinating. And it's where Indiana, like every other school, like you have to have the pieces in place from a system perspective to allow you, if you have the right players, to play at a high level efficiently on both ends of the ball. This is, again, not rocket science, but I think it gets lost in the shuffle. And there's a code here. And this is the thing. It's not just what you said. Like this is 100% not a new thing. Historically, the teams that make it to this level are very efficient in both sides. Where it is new, though, is how much more efficient overall the top teams are this year versus what they've been in the past. Because and again, I explained this in the podcast on Monday, but this net efficiency rating, you can compare it from year to year. If you take a team's adjusted offensive efficiency, subtract it from their adjusted defensive efficiency, that's your net efficiency rating. It's so much higher this year than it has been in almost any other year, because most of the time it's a net efficiency of about, somewhere in the 30 to 32 range. You'll have teams that'll bust up above that. They don't always win titles. Like famously, one of the best prior to this year was that Kentucky team in 2015 that was 38-0 going into the Final Four and then loses to Wisconsin. But the fact that they were in the Final Four illustrates how important that was. But then, the teams below them were 3 or 4 points below them. This year, you've got like this cluster of teams that are very highly rated. And it's why, to some degree, from just a purely coaching and roster assemblage perspective, a change had to be made this year because Indiana was really continuing to go down this pathway where they were falling further behind the very top teams. It's going to take a couple of years, I think, at the very least, to really get Indiana into that mix. But I do feel like there's a better chance right now of getting there, given how DeVries likes to coach.
The other thing I'll say with roster building, and it's been pretty stark, I think, for years, but again, this year in this tournament, this is not statistical, so I have no data to back this up. But just watching, Michigan State play Ole Miss, or watching Purdue play Houston, and I know Michigan State won, but there was just moments where it's like, dude, Ole Miss just looks more athletic. And you see this over and over again. I know he's not playing, but it feels like, Auburn, Alabama, they're built up of guys that all look like Brandon Miller, who I know, left 2 years ago, but they're all like 6'8", unbelievably long, can basically play the 2 to 5. And you look at teams like, again, Auburn, Tennessee, Ole Miss, Alabama, Florida, and it's like, those don't look like Big Ten teams at all. Yeah. And like some of the dudes on Houston, it's like, I don't see anybody like that in the Big Ten anytime we play. And it's something, again, it's not a metric piece, but it's just something as someone who's watched basketball for 30 plus years, it's like we need more players like that, not at Indiana, but just also in the Big Ten to compete against. And it does feel like when we've had success, it's almost been, Michigan State gets a bunch of big guys and slows it down, or, Edey is just this anomaly of a type of player that's like nobody knows how to deal with. I don't know. That is something that's kind of very stark in contrast when you see these Big Ten teams go up against some of the SEC teams. It's like, man, it's not even that they have, one dude who's awesome. It's like they got 5 guys, and I don't see any of those in the Big Ten.
No, I got a chance to watch both Kentucky, Tennessee, and Houston, Purdue on Friday in person. And as happens often when we go watch teams from other conferences, I was taken aback by how much more just physically imposing and athletic the players on, especially Houston and Tennessee were. Now, I give Purdue a ton of credit for sticking in that game the way that they did, but Purdue really had to walk a tightrope in that game to get to the point where they were in it at the end. And like Houston was just such a physically dominant team in that game, and it created a lot of problems for Purdue in terms of they couldn't make a lot of the passes they normally like to make. They where Purdue kept themselves in that game was they figured out a way to play really good defense against Houston. Houston had a bad shooting day. Houston shot 37% from 2 in that game. To some degree, Purdue was a little lucky that they were in the game as late as they were, because they were clearly at a physical disadvantage in that contest. What's ironic is, like, if you take Tennessee as an example, it wasn't like Tennessee recruited all those guys as freshmen. Yes, Zakai Ziegler's been there, but like Chaz Lanier was available for people to pull in. Chaz Lanier played 4 years at North Florida and then comes in and fits right in from a physicality perspective. Felix Okpara started his career at Ohio State, played 2 years at Ohio State, and then ended up transferring there. So there is certainly some stylistic issues with the Big Ten, and the roster building has felt like, to some degree, it's focused on how do we defeat Zach Edey, or how do we deal with those situations. But it's been a longer standing issue with the Big Ten in general, where
it's very similar to, like, I'm playing Super Mario Bros. Like, I can beat level 1. It's like, oh, level 2? Like, I didn't realize there's another Bowser I got to deal with.
Yeah. But outside of Michigan State, which has done a pretty good job of recruiting on a national level, and Michigan, I would say, which has gone the route of they've both played a very advanced offensive style at times under John Beilein, but they've also grabbed NBA caliber athletes. The Big Ten, partially because of how it's allowed to be refereed and because of the dominance of certain coaches, has just gone down a pathway that it's very hard to compete against top-level Big 12 and SEC teams and the very top level of the ACC, because the athletes just aren't there. The overall effectiveness and the relative talent levels are not there across the board. And UConn, I think you can fit into the same category, where they've been able to piece together rosters that are full of those sorts of guys. So all I'll say in closing is there's a really interesting spot here for the Big Ten, where you've got Darren DeVries coming in, has Big 12 experience. You've got Nico Medved, who's been a pretty effective coach at the mid-major level. You've got Dusty May, who's in his first year. You've got Ben McCollum, who is really more old Big Ten than new Big Ten, and I'm curious to see how that particular style works. But you're starting to see a changeover. Tom Izzo's not going to be coaching a whole lot longer. You saw Greg Gard have to change his entire approach this year to go to a different type of system. So now Wisconsin's kind of off of the train that they've been on with their rosters. This is where the Big Ten really has to get serious. And this is where, much as I may dislike Greg Sankey, his emphasis on building great basketball programs in the SEC and the schools following suit and really focusing on the right types of things with scheduling and recruiting and getting guys in the transfer portal has made a big difference. And there's nothing to say the Big Ten can't do that. With all the money the Big Ten's got, it needs to do it. It just needs to start doing it quickly because, you're about to go into a Final Four here where unless Michigan State pulls off what would be an upset against Auburn, you're going to have no Big Ten teams in the Final Four. And that's not a good situation for the Big Ten to be in, because it's not just that you don't have teams in the Final Four, it's that the teams that are in the Final Four look like they're playing a different sport to some degree from how the Big Ten is playing it.
Yep.
So anyway, that'll wrap it up for us today. Any final thoughts, Scott?
No. It goes way back to the beginning of the pod. I totally missed it, but I was joking the other day about DeVries going to the Indiana State title game, which I'm very happy to see. Like, that's a nice thing. I was just wondering, when he went to go pick up his credentials, if they're like, oh, we haven't seen Indiana. Like, sorry, you're in the balcony this year. Like, you got to work. Indiana has to work their way back down to the floor. Like, sorry, when you don't show up for 7 years, IU, you'll work your way down. But no, I'm joke about it. I'm very happy to see that he was at the Indiana State title. It feels like that needs to be that's part of your job as the Indiana coach. And it's good to see that we are recognizing that again.
Yeah, it's one of those,
everything changing, and maybe you don't recruit any kids from Indiana. You just do all the transfer portal. It's like it is still the high school coaches are still the ones that they are the infantry in your army for Indiana basketball. And I always say there may not be a player there right now that you want to recruit, but those coaches at some point are going to have a player you want to recruit.
Yeah.
And so, it's sales 101. If I only come to you when I need something, we're not going to have a tough time negotiating. If we're always going out for coffee and talking, then suddenly when you need something, I'm much more, present in your mind. So it's a small and a huge thing all at the same time for me.
Yeah. There's a lot of relationship building. It's not just about the money. The money is very important, but there are relationships that need to be built, and that does start early. And the idea that you could just survive by pulling guys out of the portal that you didn't have a lot of prior relationships with, I mean, we saw that attempt made. I don't think it worked. So a lot of things in the mix, but with basketball being as culturally important as it is here in Indiana, just, go to the tournaments. Like, go put yourself in a position where you can be seen, where you can make connections. It is a big part of the job, whether or not you want it to be. So anyway, that'll wrap it up for us. We'll be back later on in the week, hopefully with some news on things going on, portal news, coaching news, anything, as college basketball winds down the 24-25 season. For Scott, I'm Galen. This is Crimson Cast. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel, subscribe to the Substack. We'll be back with more soon. Stay never daunted. Bring back the Bison. So long, everybody.